All right, team, this is the one about mortgage assumptions. I've had so many people asking me this question, mostly real estate agents that are looking for new ways to promote homes. What is a mortgage assumption? What makes a mortgage assumable? Okay, guys, here's the nitty-gritty. It sounds so flashy and fancy to have an assumable mortgage. Think about it this way. If someone's going to assume the mortgage, that means the seller of the home is going to let the buyer take over their mortgage or assume their mortgage. So it sounds really flashy to say, hey, buy my house and you'll get my 2.25% interest rate from 2020, right? But assumable mortgages and mortgage assumptions are not all that they're cracked up to be. Let's talk about it. Typically, an assumable mortgage is going to be an FHA or a VA home loan. You're not going to see very many conventional loans that are going to be assumable. There are some ways that a conventional mortgage can be considered assumable, and this also applies for FHA and VA. Death or divorce are a couple of ways that a conventional loan may become assumable. You will always contact the current servicer of the loan for all of their idiosyncrasies, rules, costs, etc. But these are just some general rules of thumb. And it sounds really great, right? 2.5% interest, 2.25% interest, assume my loan. Let's do the math on some of this. Let's say the seller bought the home 5 years ago. They want to have the buyer assume their mortgage. Sounds like a great deal because they have such a great interest rate. However, what people don't remember is there's also appreciation involved. So let's say the seller bought the house, got a $300,000 FHA loan, but now they want to sell the house for $450,000. The buyer can only assume the mortgage amount that remains, so that's probably going to be less than $300,000. You guessed it, that's right. That FHA buyer assuming the mortgage is going to only be able to assume that $300,000 that's left. Guys, that means that your buyer will have to come to closing with $150,000. Yikes, that's a lot. The other con there, if the FHA mortgage is assumable and they're assuming the loan, they're not just going to have to qualify. They're not just going to have to bring the difference in the purchase price and the mortgage that they're assuming. They're also going to assume the FHA mortgage insurance that's likely still on that loan and possibly going to be on that loan for the length of the loan. Why on earth, if you're putting $150,000 down, would you want to assume mortgage insurance with an FHA loan? You may be completely mitigating any savings that you are gaining by getting the lower interest rate. Do you see what I'm saying? So with FHA assumable, they have to qualify still. It can take months to assume the loan, and the client's gonna have to pay the difference between the original mortgage balance and the purchase price, and they're gonna have to assume that FHA mortgage insurance. Doesn't sound like quite as great of a deal at this point in time. Now, again, each servicer is going to have their own rules, stipulations, and timelines, but this is pretty typical. At Movement Mortgage, I have been told by our servicing department that an assumable mortgage, if it's being assumed, is typically going to take about 60 days. So that's even at Speed Demon Company, okay? So it's a little lengthy. Let's talk a little bit about VA assumable mortgages. So there's all kinds of stuff out there on the internet with VA assumables. When a veteran, I think it's important for me to explain this, when a veteran buys a home, they have to have a certificate of eligibility, and they have a certain amount of entitlement in order to use that eligibility for the VA loan. A person does not necessarily need to be a veteran in order to use that VA assumable mortgage. So technically your seller could let a non-veteran buyer assume their VA loan. However, it is so important for your sellers to know that if they let someone that's not a veteran assume their loan, their entitlement is going to be tied up in that home until that mortgage is paid off, refinanced, whatever, by the buyer of their property. That can be really bad if that seller wants to use a VA home loan again and go back for the 0 down VA benefit. Yee, not so great there. The other thing that's concerning with that is if a buyer is not a veteran and assumes that VA loan and then they default on that veteran's entitlement, that is going to impact that veteran's entitlement forever. Something to think about, and you want your sellers to fully understand before they offer an assumable mortgage. So the assumable mortgage sounds great in theory, but when you really dig into it, it can be a huge heartache, pain, and not even that great of a deal for your client. So please have your sellers contact their current servicer to see what the stipulations are before they can allow their mortgage to be assumable. And before you start marketing that assumable mortgage, make sure you understand what that might mean for both your buyer and your seller. I can't express enough. If a bank is not making money on a situation like letting a loan be assumed, they are not going to prioritize it. So make sure you understand that if your buyer is assuming the mortgage from the seller, it is likely going to take months. So when you look at all the cons that go along with assumable mortgages, in most instances, it is going to be better for your buyer to get their own mortgage and then refinance at a later date and time when it makes sense. Here is a quick recap of what we just learned about assumable mortgages. 1. Conventional mortgages are unlikely to be assumable unless there's a death or divorce. 2. A buyer still has to traditionally qualify to assume any mortgage. 3. Servicers are slow and they make no money off of this, so expect an assumption to take months. 4. Each servicer has its own rules, timeline, and costs. 5. The buyer is going to pay the difference in purchase price and the old loan in cash. Don't forget that appreciation. 6. If the mortgage to be assumed is FHA, the buyer is likely going to inherit mortgage insurance no matter what they put down. 7. If the assumable mortgage is VA, the seller's entitlement may be encumbered permanently. And 8, as always, contact that current servicer for your exact rules and costs.